with the final award of the night, Award for Lifetime Achievement. Please welcome again, Mrs. Lonnie Ali.
Shaquille, you make all mothers proud. I'm going to get a tape of this and play it for my son. I said, look what the great Shaquille said about his mother. He'll probably just say, well, you're not her mom. But anyway, for our final award of the night, I am honored to make this special presentation to a true hero and change maker, Bryan Stevenson. Yes. Has spent his entire life and his legal career working for justice for marginalized people and communities. He founded the Equal Justice Initiative, which for 30 years has provided legal representation to prisoners on death row, children prosecuted as adults, criminal defendants with intellectual disabilities, and people who have been abused in prison and unfairly incarcerated. Through his work, Bryan and his team have saved more than 140 wrongly convicted death row inmates from execution. Muhammad would say, this man is heavy. I can't say it right. I'm gonna have to ask you to do it, Jalen. But anyway. He also created the legacy sites in Montgomery, Alabama. The sites include the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Legacy Museum, and the Freedom Monument Sculpture Park. Through the journey of all sites, visitors take the important journey through 400 years of American history, from the slave trade to the era of Jim Crow and racial terror lynchings to our current mass incarceration crisis. His life and work have been chronicled in books, movies, TED Talks, and his countless honors and accolades. But more importantly, in the hearts and the minds of those whose lives are forever impacted and saved. I'm so proud to present him with the 2024 Muhammad Ali Lifetime Achievement Award. Please welcome and give a big round of applause to Mr. Bryan Stevenson.
Well, this is such an extraordinary honor, and what a great night. I knew this would be a really wonderful evening. I didn't know how wonderful it was going to be, but I have to first say to these young people who are so inspiring, who are so impressive, what a thrill it is for me to learn about the work that you are doing and to hear you talk about the passions, the visions, the hopes you have to change the world. It gives me a lot of hope. And I'm also thrilled to be getting this award with such extraordinary honorees, Don G. and Nile Rodgers and the amazing Shaquille O'Neal. I feel in many ways pretty unworthy for a Lifetime Achievement Award, mostly because I feel like I'm still in the middle of things. But this award gave me an opportunity to reflect, and it made me realize how grateful I am for the legacy of Muhammad Ali. As a little boy growing up, he represented the kind of vision, the kind of courage, the kind of strength. Every time he fought, my entire extended family, people all over the community would come together, and I loved those nights because we were all sitting together, rooting for him to win, not just a fight, but a step forward for many of us who felt marginalized and excluded, disfavored, ignored, mistreated. And that was the greatness of his career and his identity. He did more than fight boxing matches. He fought for these ideas that were so transformational. And I'm an unlikely person, like many of you, to be in this place. I grew up in a community where I started my education in a colored school. When I was a little boy, they didn't let black kids go to the public schools. I grew up in a community where my dad couldn't go to high school, not because he wasn't smart or hardworking, but there were no high schools for black people in our county when he was a teenager. And so the adults around me didn't have high school degrees, not because they weren't smart, not because they weren't hardworking, but because there were literally no opportunities. And lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools. And because of that intervention, I got to go to high school, I got to go to college, and I decided to go to law school because I wanted to help other people who might be marginalized and disfavored. And I was thinking about this. I went to Harvard Law School, and on the first day of law school, they put us in a small group, and they asked us to go out with 12 or 13 other students. They were trying to make us comfortable, and the student group leader took us someplace. And she asked a very basic, simple question. She didn't ask anything intentionally kind of harmful. She just asked, why are you here? How did you get here? And I remember that day because on that first day, all of my classmates started talking about why they were in law school, and each of them talked about being the son or the daughter or the grandson or the granddaughter or the nephew or the niece of a lawyer. And after the fourth or fifth student talked about their familial relationship, I started to get nervous because I realized I wasn't related to a lawyer. And then they kept doing it. Every student had this family relationship. And when they got to the seventh or eighth student, I realized something I hadn't even realized until that moment. And what I realized is that not only was I not related to a lawyer, on that day, my first day in law school, I realized I'd never even met a lawyer. And when they got to me, I felt so diminished and so unqualified. I didn't answer the question. I told a joke, I distracted people, I didn't say what I should have said. And after that meeting, I ran and I called my mom, and I've got a mom like Shaquille's mom, and I called my mom, I said, Mom, I don't think I belong here. These kids are all very different from me. And my mother said, what is wrong with you? You belong wherever you go. She said, you're the smartest person in the world. You can do anything you want to do. And then she said, now you go back and tell those kids why you're really in law school. And I felt better after I talked to my mom, but I knew I couldn't go back and tell those kids why I was in law school. That would be too awkward. And 2 weeks into my first year law school career, I was still feeling off. And then I decided to do what my mom told me to do, and I actually asked the kids in my group if they would come together and meet. It was very awkward. But I asked them to come, and I said, I got to tell you, I wasn't honest on the first day of law school. I didn't tell you why I'm really in law school, and I feel the need to tell you now. And what I told them is that I'm in law school because my great-grandfather was enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia. And as a teenager, while he was enslaved, he had a hope of freedom so powerful that he learned to read. In the 1850s, it wasn't a rational hope to believe that you'd be free. He didn't know a civil war was coming a decade later, but he had this hope of freedom, and he learned to read. There were anti-literacy laws in the states where people were enslaved. If you learned to read while you were enslaved, you could be killed or sold or beaten because it was against the law. And yet, my great-grandfather risked his life to learn to read. And after emancipation, my grandmother told me that once a week, my great-grandfather would stand on the porch of their home, and he would read the newspaper to formerly enslaved people who didn't know how to read because he wanted them to know what was going on. And she said she loved the fact that her father knew how to read. It made her so proud. And when he would start reading, she said she would push her siblings aside and get close to him and wrap her arms around his leg. And she told me later that she would wrap her arms around his leg when he started reading because she thought that's how you learned to read, was by touching somebody while they read. And he figured out what she was doing. He said, no, Victoria, I'm going to teach you how to read. And he taught my grandmother how to read. My grandmother worked as a domestic every day of her life. She lived into her 90s, cleaned other people's houses her whole life, but she was a reader. She had 10 children, and she made sure that all of her children were readers. She wanted all of her grandchildren to be readers. I'd go visit my grandmother at 5 or 6 years old, and she would stand on the porch sometimes with a stack of books. And she'd make you read something from the book before she'd even let you inside the house. And she was really strategic. She'd say, what do you want for dessert, Bryan? And I'd come up with something crazy, and she'd go in the kitchen and make it. It smelled so good, I'd go run into the kitchen, and there she'd be with those stack of books. I grew up in a poor, racially isolated community. People in our community had outhouses. Not everybody had running water. There was a lot of despair. You didn't see much hope outside the door. People worked in the poultry plants. People didn't have a lot. We were segregated and excluded. There were all kinds of reasons to feel bad about yourself. But my mother did something when we were kids. My mother went into debt when I was 9 years old, and she saved up her pennies, and she bought us the World Book Encyclopedia. And we had those books in our house, and you didn't see much hope outside the door, but you could find hope in these books. And so I'd never met a lawyer, but I read about lawyers as a kid coming up. And I'm not going to lie, when I was 10 years old, I wasn't really that into it. I didn't understand it. You know, Christmas comes along, you go outside, your friends are like, well, I got a basketball for Christmas. I got a baseball. I got a bicycle. And I'd have to say, well, I got volume G of the World Book Encyclopedia. But when I got to Harvard Law School, I realized I got there because I was standing on the shoulders of 10 million people who were enslaved in this country. And many of the enslaved had this hope of freedom that allowed them, that pushed them to survive. And we don't talk enough about the other side of slavery, the trauma, the abuse, the humiliation, the degradation. It was all around us. But the other part of slavery is that our enslaved foreparents found a way to love in the midst of agony. They found a way to create generations of people who could do something that they couldn't do. And because of their hope for freedom, my grandparents fled the Deep South and the terror violence that was ravaging in this country for the first half of the 20th century, when thousands of black people were pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned and tortured. Our great-grandparents, my grandparents fled and found a way because they had this hope. And I grew up during the time, my parents grew up during the time of segregation. And they'd see those signs, white and colored, back to the back, and all of that stuff, that humiliating stuff. And those signs weren't directions, they were actually injuries. And despite that, there were this hopeful people. I am the heir of a hopeful generation of people. I live in Montgomery, Alabama. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. The people who came before me would put on their Sunday best. They'd go someplace to reach, to push for the right to vote, the right to be respected. They'd be on their knees praying. They'd get beaten and battered and bloodied. But then they would go home and clean the blood, change their clothes, and go back and do it again. And it's that hope that allowed me to go to law school. And so what I want to say to all of the awardees, and not just the awardees, but to everybody in this room, if we really want to honor the life and legacy of Muhammad Ali, we have got to be hopeful people when we leave here. We have to be hopeful. I don't subscribe to the politics of fear and anger. I don't like the politics of fear and anger, because I believe when people allow themselves to be governed by fear and anger, they start to tolerate things they should never tolerate. They start to accept things they should never accept. When I look around the world at the worst moments of world history, human history, it's moments where these narratives of fear and anger were prevailing. And so I believe we have to fight against the politics of fear and anger, but we cannot be hopeless when we leave this place. I believe that Muhammad Ali understood the power of hope. He was hope for millions of us. Every time he stood up, every time he spoke, every time he did something that made us proud, and we've got to be hopeful too. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice will prevail where hopelessness persists, and so we have to be hopeful when we leave here tonight. We've got to tap into our superpower. We've got to do like Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was a great leader, a great fighter, but he was also an activist. And Muhammad Ali would stand up even when people said sit down. He would speak even when people said be quiet. He would do the hard thing because it was the right thing. And that is the legacy of Muhammad Ali. And I want to thank Lonnie, I want to thank everybody who's part of this great effort in Louisville to never allow the legacy and life of Muhammad Ali to be diluted, to be misinterpreted, to be compromised. But you make it a star, a light that lights the way for so many of us. And when you give awards to these unbelievably talented young people, when you include people like me and so many of the other awardees, I hope we can honor you in continuing to do the work that must be done. I am persuaded, really three simple things. My work is about this basic idea. I think that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. And so I go into the jails and prisons and I stand with the condemned, the marginalized, the excluded. And it's hard, but it is also wonderful, because when you stand next to condemned people, disfavored people, hated people, forgotten people, you sometimes have the opportunity to harness the power of grace and mercy and compassion and do something beautiful. I think we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I think if you tell a lie, you're not just a liar. If you take something, you're not just a thief. I am also persuaded that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think sometimes we talk too much about money, but as we've heard over and over again tonight, I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we create a world where we can deconstruct all of these structures and systems that feed the poor. And finally, I believe, in the spirit of Muhammad Ali, we're not going to be judged by how much money we make, about the celebrity we achieve, the privileges we enjoy. I believe we're ultimately going to be judged by what we do for other people who are in need, for the poor, the forgotten, the neglected. And it's with that, I am really thrilled to have this relationship with the Ali Center, with Muhammad Ali, and to be in this community of remarkable people. Thank you all very, very much for this great, great award. Thank you.